Morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. Give people a moment to get settled. My name's Mark Zivin, and I serve on J Street's National Finance Committee, as well as I'm J Street's Political Finance Committee Chair in Chicago. For those of you who were there last night, you know I'm from Chicago. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to take out their cell phones. If anybody still has a pager, then you have to get into the 21st century. But turn those off. And here's how the session is going to work this morning. We're going to begin momentarily with each panelist having about 5 minutes to give us an introduction of what's going on from their point of view. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of panel discussion. And then we will have take questions and answers from the floor. And I was told that you should line up at the microphone in the center of the facility where they're pointing over there. It's not the center, but it's on stage right, which is your left. Okay. First of all, I would like to introduce Heather Hurlburt, who is the second one on my left. She's the executive director of the National Security Network. And before joining NSN, she served as special assistant and speechwriter to President Bill Clinton. She was also a speechwriter for Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher. She was also a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. She appears frequently as a commentator in both new and traditional media and is a regular guest on Robert Wright's Blogging Heads TV. On her left is Dr. Shibley Telhami. He's the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and he's a senior fellow at the Sabin Center at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Telhami is the author of numerous books and articles on U.S. public policy, the Arab-Israeli peace process, and Persian Gulf security. He will have a forthcoming book this summer called Peace Puzzle, U.S. Diplomacy in the Middle East, 1989 to 2009, co-authored by Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who'll be speaking later in the session, later in the program, the conference, today, so you should look for that. That'll be coming out in the summer. He participated in the Iraq Study Group. He served as an advisor to the State Department. He's been a principal investigator in the annual Arab Public Opinion Survey conducted since 2002 in 6 Arab countries. He's the author of a recent poll that conducted in Israel last month with some startling conclusions about the topic at hand. I know we'll be interested in hearing that. On the far left is retired Brigadier General Slomo Brom. He's a senior research associate at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, specializing in Israeli-Palestinian relations and Israel national security defense. During his distinguished career, General Brom served as director of the IDF's Strategic Planning Division, participated in comprehensive peace and regional security negotiations with the Palestinians, Jordan, and Syria. He's a former deputy to Israel's National Security Advisor, and from 2005 to 2006, General Brom was a member of the Moderator Commission. It was established by the Defense Ministry to re-examine the state of Israel's fundamental national security strategy and doctrine. Finally, we're very glad to host our moderator, Barbara Slavin. Barbara is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and Washington correspondent for almonitor.com, a brand new website devoted to news pertaining to the Middle East. I think the unique thing about this website is it actually takes translations from Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew, and definitely should check it out. It's al-monitor.com. She's a regular commentator on U.S. foreign policy and Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. And she also is author of another thing that I think you should check out if you would like to have a little bit more in-depth feel for what the Iranian psyche is like, and that's a book called Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for getting up so early. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and I can understand why the room is full. Predictions about whether Israel will attack Iran have become so common that they're beginning to remind me of the dog on the roof that Gail Collins always talks about when she writes about Romney. It always comes up in the conversation, and I think what we're going to try to get to the bottom of today are whether these threats are real or whether they're a tactic that's been used very successfully by the Israelis to deter the Iranians from building a bomb and to terrorize the rest of the world into putting draconian sanctions on Iran. Is it a tactic? And if so, is there a danger that Israel is crying wolf and that people will eventually get cotton on to this and will stop taking the Israeli threats so seriously, and that includes the Iranians? We're going to talk about the consequences of a military strike if one were to occur from Israel and or from the United States, what the impact would be on the global economy, on Israel, and on the Iranians themselves. And I think we're going to talk about some of what President Obama has referred to as the loose talk of war. I mean, we have been involved in 2 wars now over the past decade, and as we all know, the consequences of those wars have been much more serious than the proponents of those conflicts led us to believe, certainly when we started. A few basics about Iran. It's 3 times the size of Iraq with 3 times the population. Its nuclear materials are dispersed widely among a number of facilities, and some of those facilities are underground. Iran has some of the most sophisticated and well-educated physicists and other scientists in the world, despite sanctions. Its universities are very high caliber, and I think we have to realize that any kind of bombing, any kind of attack is not going to destroy the knowledge that is implanted in the minds of these scientists. We also know that Iran has unified very strongly in the past against foreign aggression. If we look at the consequences of a strike for Israel, I think we have to take into account, and I'm sure our panelists will, the situation in the Middle East right now, the flux of the Arab world, and think about what an Israeli preventive strike on Iran would do to Israel's posture in the region, and what it would do in terms of rallying Arab opinion, which is already not exactly predisposed to like Israel, against Israel even further. What it would also do in terms of anti-Semitism more generally, and I'm thinking now of the horrible situation we saw in France last week. The International Atomic Energy Agency has questions about whether Iran has conducted research into building a nuclear weapon. There's certainly ample reason for those suspicions, but so far no one has said that Iran has actually decided to build a weapon. And predictions that Iran would have a weapon next year, I think the Israelis have been predicting every year since 1994 that next year Iran will have a nuclear weapon. So again, there are problems here about perhaps crying wolf on this. My own view is that Iran benefits from a posture of nuclear ambiguity, and that this is more useful to it than actually possessing weapons. Building a bomb would contradict Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's fatwa, which he just reiterated earlier this month, that nuclear weapons are a great sin. At the same time, Iran is already experiencing draconian sanctions, the worst sanctions that have ever been imposed against it since the Islamic Republic was formed. And I hope we'll talk perhaps a little bit about whether there's a danger now with these sanctions that Iranian officials may no longer believe that they can get sanctions relief by making concessions on the nuclear program. Many of them, I think, believe that these sanctions are designed to change the regime and not the regime's behavior. There have been some recent developments since that other Jewish organization held its conference a few weeks ago, and that suggest a slight softening of the tone on Iran by the United States and by Iran in terms of the nuclear program. President Obama, in my view, read Bibi Netanyahu the Riot Act when he was here and said, no, you will not attack Iran this year. We can talk about that as well. Even people like Jeffrey Goldberg, who has predicted with great regularity that there will be an Israeli strike on Iran, does not seem to think so, at least for the next several months. I interviewed him last week, and he said, no, it will not be this year, and it is a bad idea. So that's important from somebody who seems to be very close to the Israeli leadership in terms of interpreting their views. But I think we always have to worry about inadvertent conflict. What happens if an Israeli ambassador is assassinated by an Iranian terrorist? What happens if some Iranian hotshot in the Persian Gulf gets lucky and actually strikes an American warship? I think these contingencies are the sorts of things that keep American military officials up late at night. I would imagine Israelis are thinking about it as well. So with that, very brief introduction. I'm going to turn the mic over first to Heather, who's going to talk a little bit about the U.S. policy perspective and where she thinks the Obama administration is on this issue right now. And then Shibley Telhami will talk about his recent poll and also about Arab views of Iran and Arab views of a possible Israeli strike on Iran. And then finally, just to keep you all awake, we have our true expert on Israeli policy, General Brom, will tell us whether Israel is going to attack Iran this year. And we won't tell anybody, right? And or whether this whole thing has been an effort by Bibi just to keep us all on the edges of our seats. So with that, I'm going to ask Heather to come up and talk.
Thanks and good morning, and I want to thank J Street not just for having me, but for the second year in a row by having me at this hour. No, just wait, getting me out of my regular Sunday morning responsibility teaching at my son's co-op Hebrew school. So thank you for giving me an excuse to skip Hebrew school. I want to use my 5 minutes to make 3 points, which may seem quite counterintuitive. The first point being that the reason that we are here having this discussion in the American context is not about Iran, and it's not even really about Israel. It's about a debate about U.S. leadership and U.S. role in the world, and how do you solve a president like Barack Hussein Obama. Second, a point about U.S. policy, which is that there's really a pretty strong consensus and durable consensus among U.S. policymakers that a strike on Iran would be a bad idea, but there's not a vision about what we need to do instead. And third, if there were to be an Israeli strike, either because the Israelis decided to have a strike or for the sort of accidental reasons that Barbara referred to, which are definitely the things that keep me up at night as well, the consequences would, in the medium to long term, potentially be actually quite damaging to the U.S.-Israeli relationship in a way that I think advocates of war with Iran have not fought through. So now that I've given you the summary, because it's 8:30 in the morning, I'll go back and talk a little more about each of those. So why is Iran the only foreign policy issue that has been raised with any regularity in U.S. presidential politics this year? Let's just get this out of the way now. It's not because of the Jewish vote, and it's not because of the Jewish lobby, either one of them. And it's not even because of Iran and its nuclear weapons program, I would argue. It is because we are still having, or again having in Groundhog Day-like fashion, an argument about how the U.S. is going to act in the world in the 21st century. What shows leadership, and after 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, what shows strength? Second, you have Karl Rove, who's a very, very smart political strategist who has observed that when your opponent has a strength, you don't go where your opponent is weak. You go after your opponent's strength. And so if polls show that President Obama is stronger on national security than any other issue, you try to find a way to make him look weak on national security. You cannot do that by attacking him over Osama bin Laden, so you look around and you find something else. And Iran is what they found. And as I say, this is a sort of good, time-tested political strategy. It was used with great success by candidate Obama against war hero John McCain in 2008. It was used by President Bush against war hero John Kerry in 2004. I could go on and on. So this is, it's within the normal political order of things, but it is producing some very frightening consequences. And I think it's just worth remembering that when we think about this issue. Second, it just bears stressing over and over again, as Nick Kristof says in the Times this morning, there really is not anyone in the U.S. government, you do not find leadership in the military or the intelligence establishment who thinks that a bombing attack on Iran would have either good results in terms of meaningfully dismantling or setting back their nuclear program, or in terms of what it would do in the region. Now, why is the Pentagon worried about this? Number one, you had the amazing spectacle of the Secretary of Defense going to the Wall Street Journal and saying, look, our bunker buster bombs can't get at the Iranian program, which might seem a somewhat surprising thing for a Secretary of Defense to say, but he was signaling both to the Israelis and to the Iranians that we know the limits of our program. And I think we'll probably hear more from General Brom about the Israeli view of this, but there's certainly been a lot of reporting lately suggesting that the Israeli and U.S. military establishments share a pretty close and pretty pessimistic view about this. Second, the Pentagon still has an awful lot of troops in the region. If you remember, Iran on the other side borders Afghanistan, and feels acutely vulnerable to what Iran and its non-state actor allies could do as pushback, as response to an Israeli or U.S. attack. And the Pentagon does not want to see that, does not want to see another Beirut barracks, for those of you who are old enough to remember that, and has let Israel know that in no uncertain terms. Similarly, and this is a positive development since in just the last month, you see pretty clearly that there's strong support in President Obama's own party and among the realist wing of the Republican Party for avoiding a military strike, at least for now. You haven't gotten 100-0 votes in the House and the Senate on the sort of latest, let's declare war in advance sorts of resolutions that have been put forward. Now, to go back to something else Barbara said, we have in the U.S., for various political and substantive reasons, and in some cases because people actually leave it, sanctions have been really established in the policymakers' minds as the alternative to war. But that's a problem because if you want to negotiate, you do have to be able to offer something. And anyone who looks at the U.S. political system, be they Iranian, American, Israeli, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, is going to conclude that there's no realistic hope of lifting sanctions anytime soon. So that really handicaps Washington in negotiating. And then the last point I would make about that is that there's an entire conversation that is not happening outside of wonderfully rarefied academic and think tank circles where people's jobs don't depend on politics and don't depend on political money, about what is it that we want to see in the region in the medium term. You've got 3 or 4 huge unknowns right now. What is Iran's place in the region? What is the place of Egypt? Where's that going to go? What on earth is going to happen in Syria, by the way, Iran's last ally in the region? Saudi Arabia, and I hope Dr. Telhami will talk about this a lot more wisely than I can, but there's no view in Washington about what comes next, and there's very little ability to have a conversation about how we strategically see the world, which makes it very hard to have sensible policy. Now, Having said all of that, what would happen if we all walked out of here, because of course you've all got your phones turned off, but if our phones started buzzing and it turned out that the Israeli military had cleverly taken advantage of General Brom's being out of the country to launch a strike, what would we all wake up to on Monday morning in Washington? And I would highlight a few things. The oil markets would go nuts. There have been predictions that the price of oil would go up as much as $30 to $40 a barrel in the event of a full-out war. What I think we've seen in recent weeks is that in addition to just fears about supply, there are also speculators who have learned to watch fears about supply, so we would see a big jump in oil prices. We would see huge jitters on our stock market, and then these sort of interesting questions are what the knock-on effects of that around the world would be, what that would do to the weak but hopefully strengthening consensus to end the crisis in Europe, how that would then knock back on us, and would even a pinprick strike be enough to knock us back into recession? And then there'd be an interesting political blame game that would start about that, making our politics even more awful than they already are. Second, the Pentagon would be furious if there were an Israeli attack after the Pentagon had repeatedly said, no, no, no. And that would result in a real weakening lack of trust between the US and Israeli militaries, and I think most of us would feel that that was not a good thing. And there would be a lot of reassessment in Washington, and there would be voices at the Pentagon that would want there to be consequences in other aspects of the US-Israeli security relationship, which would be a very challenging thing for an American administration to deal with, both politically and substantively. Then let's say Iran and its proxies launch some retaliatory attacks within a day or two. And it's important not to Iran does not have proxies in the US that can knock down the Twin Towers or their equivalent. Iran does not have proxies in the US that can alter our way of life or defeat our system of government. But there's no question, as we saw in France last week, there are individuals and organizations that can inflict a lot of pain on our society. And also potentially, as I said, on US troops, particularly in Afghanistan, because that's where we have the most of them now. So then after all of that happens, what are the medium-term implications? And this, again, hasn't really been talked about very much, but what do that set of events do to the US-Israel relationship? That you have a public that on the one hand is very willing to rally around when a president says we need to use force, but is sick to death of war, is sick to death of sending troops overseas, is sick to death of spending the money, of having to read the accounts in the papers of what happens when you send Americans overseas 3, 4, and 5 times, and is uncomfortable with what that suggests we might be becoming. So if that anger gets radiated back on the US-Israel relationship, that's not a good thing, my point of view. It's hard to see how, after the immediate outcomes I've laid out, the US avoids getting pulled into a regional war, and then how that plays out in a way that potentially further amplifies all the first order implications I've laid out. And then that brings us back to where I began, which is what does that do to the US political system? And who does that empower? I think actually in a nonpartisan way, those of us who are here this morning are obviously here because we all like the idea of the US being deeply engaged in the world, close with other countries, and active on behalf of shared values in the world. And what I think you've seen over the last decade is the more the US gets bogged down in unwinnable, bleeding wars, the more the aspect of US public opinion and US politics that says, no, let's pull back from the world, it's a jungle out there, there's nothing good we can do, is strengthened. And that's not a place any of us wants to go from an American perspective or from a US-Israeli perspective, and so I would just end with that.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure for me to speak before you, and thank you all for being so controversial in Washington by being pro-peace. That is something really astonishing for a peace professor. Let me just make a few points. One about the Arab context of the Iran crisis, and a few points about Israeli public opinion from the polling. I know the General will be speaking more about the strategic picture, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my findings. Let me start with the Arab picture. Now, it is true, and I think you get that report a lot in the press, that some Arab governments really wouldn't mind seeing Iran hit militarily. And I think that's been reported. There are a number of diplomats who've said that and accurately reported that they said that. I think the general sentiment in the Arab world, you have to start by differentiating government position from public opinion. At the government level, I think it is incorrect to say that most Arab governments want to see war with Iran. Actually, most of them are rather worried about war with Iran, and including in some of the Gulf states who are genuinely worried about the expansion of Iranian influence broadly and what an Iran nuclear weapon might do. Even within those governments, there are disagreements. There is no unanimity even within those governments. So the governmental position in the Arab world is very mixed and more concerned, frankly, across the board than it is encouragement. At the public level, it's more universal. And we have to understand where Arab public is. And I just report to you quickly my findings from the annual Arab public opinion poll that I do that includes not only Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, and Lebanon, but also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the two countries that have a lot to worry about when it comes to Iran. And one of the questions I asked is, name the two countries that pose the biggest threat to you personally. I ask this question every single year. And across the board, every single year, I get the same answer as I did after the Arab Spring began in October 2011, which is the overwhelming majority first names Israel, and second names the United States, and third names Iran. And that pattern holds even for Saudi Arabia. So, in fact, across the board in the 2010 and 2009, I would get something like 80% name Israel, 70% name the US, and only about 10% names Iran as one of the two biggest threats to them. In the 2011, Iran is a little higher, and it is a little higher in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but still the pattern is the same, where you have Israel as number one. So if you've got, it's not that they love Iran, but they don't see Iran as the biggest threat at the public level, even in the Gulf region, and they see Israel as a bigger threat. So if you are going to have war between Israel and Iran, guess who they're going to be rooting for? Don't kid yourself. They'll be rooting for Israel getting a bloody eye. Even at the government level, frankly, among those who might hope for war between Israel and Iran, you got to think about that in the context of the 1980s, when the Israelis were not unhappy to see two countries they didn't like, Iraq and Iran, bloody each other and weaken each other. And so you've got to put that in a little bit of context and perspective in terms of what the wishes are at the general public level. The second issue on Arab public opinion is that the overwhelming majority of Arab public opinion does not want to see even international pressure against Iran's nuclear program. The overwhelming majority, 2/3. And that, by the way, holds even for Arab citizens of Israel. A majority of Arab citizens of Israel that I polled in November 2011 do not want to see international pressure to stop Iran's nuclear program, let alone war. And the reason for it is this issue of double standards and how they view the threats. So the Arab public isn't on the side of isolating, even on the side of sanctions against Iran, let alone war with Iran, and that obviously creates a different picture than the one that we're receiving by just focusing on some Arab diplomats being positive about the prospect of war with Iran. There is an issue that the Israelis talk about in terms of the deterrence impact of war. I mean, one of the reasons why I think the Israelis are not simply bluffing. I'll come to that at the end, are not simply bluffing. I think it's an element of bluffing, but the U.S. government has come to conclude that isn't simply bluffing, and really 3 months ago, I think the balance tipped even within government, according to reports, in favor of more than 50-50 chance they're not bluffing. We'll come back to that. But there is an element of deterrence that Israelis always worry about, and I hope the General will talk about that, a reputational element in terms of what if Israel doesn't act. And there is a perception, at least in Israel, based on the rhetoric of Hezbollah, the rhetoric of Hamas, the rhetoric of Iran and Ahmadinejad, is that Israel is being projected as weak and temporary, again, as happened back in the days of the Arab nationalism and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and that the military option is working, and that in some ways, if Israel doesn't reassert itself and reassert its strength, time may not be on its side, particularly if Iran becomes at some point so immune by hardening its nuclear facilities so immune to an Israeli or American attack. Well, I think there is a real problem with this. One problem with this is actually the Arab public is not so how should I say, accepting of the notion that Israeli deterrence doesn't work. I mean, first of all, functionally, look at Hezbollah and Hamas after the two wars. Yes, Israel has been deterred from large military actions there, but they have not, neither Hamas nor Hezbollah have been anxious to start any attacks against Israel. And when you look at public opinion, the interesting thing is in 2011, in the 2011 poll, we still get 2/3 majorities in the countries where I poll who support the two-state solution to this day. And if anything, I think the norm of nonviolence has taken hold, particularly in the Arab Spring, to the extent that you have even a group like Hamas speaking of possibly pursuing some Hamas leaders like Khalid Mash'al of pursuing nonviolence. So I don't think that idea that deterrence has failed is right. I think it's just nonsensical. I think it's all in the mind. And I think that if, in fact, you pursue another military option and it fails, or for that matter, it doesn't fail in terms of winning or losing, but all it takes is a couple of rockets falling on Tel Aviv per day, even if they don't create much damage, the attrition impact of it, and therefore the undermining of deterrence part of it, as we saw in just a couple of weeks ago in the exchanges between Hamas and Israel, where 1 million Israelis were in underground in the south, even though there were rudimentary basic rockets being shot across, and Israel has very effective, reasonably effective anti-missile defense system. So I think that my own view is that the deterrence value of an Israeli attack is overestimated, and I think it might be the counter-deterrence value is underestimated at the level of Arab public opinion. Let me just briefly say a couple of things about Israeli public opinion. I've done 2 polls over the past few months, one just 3 weeks ago, and then one I did back in November about the Iran issue. Let me tell you what the Israeli public views are. First, on the prospects of a strike by Israel without American support. Only 19% of Israelis support an Israeli strike without American support. And that's not because they don't have faith in American support after an attack. In fact, when you ask them what if Israel attacks anyway, the overwhelming majority say, well, a majority, not overwhelming, but the majority say that that the U.S. would continue to support Israel, at least diplomatically, quarters say even militarily. So it's not that they're worried about the consequences from the point of the U.S., they're worried about the consequences of the attack. They think, number one, that the war would last months or years. A majority of the Israelis think the war would last months or years, not days or weeks. A majority of Israelis think that Iran's nuclear program would be delayed by 1 to 5 years at most. And only 43% of the Israelis believe that a strike on Iran would actually weaken the Iranian government. So only a minority think it would weaken the Iran. So they're worried about the consequences, even for Iran specifically. And I happen to think that if there is an Israeli strike on Iran, the Israeli public certainly would rally behind the flag. They always do. If Israel is at war, it's a no-brainer. And by the way, I think whatever we say, we will support Israel right away, whatever it takes, no matter who's in office, whether it's an election year or not. It's a foregone conclusion. I don't think it's a no-brainer, and that's one reason why the Israelis, I think, may still do it, even with all of Obama telling them don't do it, because they know the next morning he'll be there, and then there will be some accounting later, and you can argue what that would do to American public opinion down the road. It might, it depends on the outcome. So if it's a long war that drags on and oil prices do go through the roof, and then there's no end in sight, then they could be blamed down the road. But that blame wouldn't happen the morning after. The morning after, America and the American public will be pro-Israel, and there would be no question about it in my own mind. It'll be down the road. I think the same thing would happen in Israel, but there will be an accounting, and obviously every Israeli government has to worry about that. Final point I want to make, which is on this idea of the existential threat. I know that many Israeli officials have used the term existential threat when they refer to Iran's potential of acquiring nuclear weapons, at least the capability of having nuclear weapons. And as you know, right in this building, Prime Minister Netanyahu, even invoked the Holocaust with reference to it and so forth, against the advice of many military leaders, including two Mossad, former Mossad chief and the current Mossad chief, and Barak himself, who had in the past counseled against the use of existential threat in reference to the Iranian program. And so my own conclusion is very similar to Aluf Ben's conclusion in Haaretz right after, which is by invoking that, despite all of the warning signs from the generals, is that you only do that if you really plan to attack. Because if you don't plan to attack, the costs are huge to you for claiming that it's existential, and then you don't do anything about it. And it's huge for morale of the Israeli public. What if you wake up the next morning and Iran does have a nuclear program? It's huge for your deterrence capacity, because you're saying that you lose your deterrence if Iran has it. It's huge for Arab public opinion. So the consequence of it is huge, and it makes no sense to use that analogy unless you already decided to attack. And for me, that is a sign that there is, in fact, it's an intent of preparation of public opinion, not just a mere tactical instrument. And to give you a sense of the potential consequence for the Israeli public opinion, in November, in the public opinion poll that I did among Israeli Jews only in November, we found that 2/3 of the Israeli public accepts the idea of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, including Israel totally giving up its nuclear weapons as long as Iran and the Arab states agree not to have them, obviously with verifiable inspections. I mean, that is the state of affairs. My own judgment on that is that this Israeli public opinion is very much affected by the notion of the existential threat. When you posit Iran having nuclear weapons as an existential threat, and then you are very accepting of Iran disarming, even at the cost of you disarming as well, because you just cannot live with the consequence of Iran having nuclear weapons. So I think that issue of existential threat is worrisome to me. It does signal something, and even if it's not intended that way, it puts Israel on a course where it becomes inevitable to strike at some point. Is this going to happen the next year? Well, the bluffing argument is obviously known. I mean, there are, those people who think Israel is bluffing make very good cases. Number one is that Israel would prefer an American attack on Iran anyway, and so it puts the U.S. in a difficult position and might, put enough pressure on. I mean, look at Obama is saying the window of opportunity is closing. Well, at some point it does close, and so what do you do? Politically, it's a slippery slope. So that's one argument that people make about the bluffing. The second bluffing argument is that essentially Netanyahu wants to weaken Obama. I mean, no secret that people evaluate that Netanyahu would like to see Obama lose the election. The Iran issue is seen as an instrument of manipulating our politics. And obviously it's also a diversion from the Palestinian-Israeli issue. There was a fight for the agenda very early on, as you know, in the Obama administration that Netanyahu lost to Obama, and now the table has been reversed. You can make all those arguments, and I think some of that is obvious. I still think that it's not just bluffing. And the reason it's not just because of this existential threat argument, and it's not just because the U.S. officials must have picked up something in evaluating, sort of moving from bluffing into seriousness, but because I think the Israeli military elites have a notion of deterrence that reminds me of what happened back in 1967, that puts more weight on acting because they evaluate the non-action as being a worse option for Israel's reputation. And for that reason, I am worried that the chances of war are still better than 50-50 in the next year. Thank you very much.
Perfect intro to the general.
Good morning. I'm not going to solve the riddle for you because I don't know if Israel is going to attack the Iranian nuclear program, and in case it will do it, when it will do it. But like the previous speaker, I am convinced that the Israeli government is considering it seriously. What I don't know is what are the results of these considerations. And the Israeli government is considering it seriously not because Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon next year. That is not the assessment of the Israeli intelligence. The assessment of the Israeli intelligence is that the status of the current status of the Iranian nuclear program is such that if there is an Iranian decision, and there is no indication yet that there is an Iranian decision to make the breakthrough to the weapon, they can have a first nuclear device within 1 year, 18 months. And that is a solid assessment based on physics. But the problem is that from the point of view of Israel, the moment when the Iranians will take this decision may be too late. Because in parallel to the progress of the Iranian nuclear program, naturally, in this atmosphere of threats and counter-threats, the Iranians are taking steps to increase the protection over the nuclear programs. So when you look at the combination of the two elements, the Israeli concern is that the Iranian nuclear program will enter what Mr. Barak called a zone of immunity. The Israel is concerned that the Iranian will be in a situation in which they can decide whenever they see it fit to take the last step towards a nuclear weapon, and nothing can be done by Israel. It does mean that nothing can be done by the United States because the military capabilities are different, and there is also a huge difference in deployment. The distance between Israel and this nuclear installation in average is 1,500 kilometers. You can make the translation to miles. I'm not good in it. and that makes any military operation extremely complicated and risky, while the United States is deployed in the area, all over. I don't know what will be the results of this internal Israeli consideration, because on one hand, I am convinced that the important personalities that have to take these decisions are serious when they are presenting the seriousness of the threat of Iranian becoming a nuclear state. I don't like the way that Mr. Netanyahu uses metaphors such as the Holocaust, Hitler. I think he is wrong, but I believe that he is sincere. It's not a bluff when he is using these metaphors. I am also convinced, after a service of 25 years in our Air Force, that we can bring a large enough number of aircraft to the targets in Iran quite safely. What I don't know is, once we get there, what exactly we can do to these targets that are very well defended. And there is not enough information in the public domain that can help in making this assessment. So much of the discussions that I am reading are, in my opinion, quite empty, because they are not based on fact. They are based on speculations. What I'm concerned of is of the nature of the discourse that developed around this subject, because I think that it inhibits us from having a sober analysis that may lead to reasonable conclusions. The discourse is plagued with emotions, as I said, with worst-case analysis on one end and best-case analysis on the other end, and with a lot of disinformation. And because of that, sometimes I see things that are complete nonsense. For example, I was amazed to read in scholarly papers an analysis of the possibility that Israel will use nuclear weapons against the Iranian nuclear facilities. That is completely crazy. And because of all this noise, it is very, very difficult to differentiate, to make ends from tails. So what I can do in the short time that was left to me is to list my concerns. So the discourse, to a much extent, is focused, certainly in Israel, and also outside Israel, on the military repercussions of such an attack. What will be the effect on the Iranian nuclear program? Will we really delay it for 1 or 2 years or for 5 years? I have no clue, as I said, because I don't know enough about our capability to destroy these facilities. And then, what are the repercussions that will be a result of Iranian retaliation? This part is also plagued with exaggerations. People are talking about regional war. What is the meaning of regional war? Are we speaking about real war at all? In my opinion, what will happen between Israel and Iran is not a war. How can a war take place between two states that are, as I said, situated 1,500 kilometers from each other? It's not a war, it's exchange of blows. If it is a regional war, we will be the participants in this war, other than Iran and Israel. Syria? Syria is collapsing in the middle of a civil war, so you can erase it from the list. Hamas? Everybody is talking about Hamas participating in this. Hamas is doing now any effort to distance itself from Syria and Iran because of the effects of the Arab Spring and the need to ally themselves with their brothers, which are the Sunni Muslims, not the Shiite one. So we are left with Hezbollah. And even in the case of Hezbollah, although they have a very close and intimate and dependence on relations on Iran, I'm not so sure that their reaction will be automatic the way it is perceived. Because when I look at it politically, and one have to look politically at every one of the actors, if they will do it, the political damage for Hezbollah will be enormous. Imagine what will the people in Lebanon think when it will be so clear that Hezbollah, which pretends to be a Lebanese movement, a Lebanese nationalist movement that protects Lebanon, is sacrificing Lebanon for the interest of a foreign power. So, to sum it up, I'm not so concerned of the military repercussions of an Israeli attack. We have been in such a situation, we can get over that, and certainly that will not create a situation in which Israel will cry help, and the United States will have to come to rescue it. What I'm concerned of is the political repercussions of such an attack. Its effect on the Israeli-American relationship. Because if I was certain that the Iranians are completely rational and they are not making mistakes, then I would have said, okay, so they will launch missiles at Israel. Maybe I am wrong and Hezbollah will be dragged in also, and that's all. Can live with that. But I am concerned of an Iranian miscalculation that will lead the Iran to retaliate against the US as an ally of Israel, or against allies of the US in the Gulf, including the export of oil from the Gulf. And then one can imagine the repercussions, because the United States will have no choice but to be dragged into this conflict. Once again, whether it is a real war or not a real war, that is another matter, because nobody is talking about putting boots on the ground in Iran. It will be probably air war, sea war, not this kind of war, but anyway, the United States will be dragged to a war because of Israel. I was concerned enough when these two clowns, Walt and Mearsheimer, blamed Israel for dragging the United States into a war with Iraq. That was a completely false accusation, because I was at the meeting with the United States, and they were like a dialogue between two deafs, because the United States during these years used to say, we have to deal with Iraq, and we, the Israelis, used to tell them, no, Iraq is contained. You have to deal with Iran. And that went like that until the war in 2003. But this time it will not be a false accusation. And I am concerned of the long-term effect of that on the relationship with the United States. What will Americans think about Israel when it will happen? And also the political effect on the rest of the world. What will happen if the price of oil will rise, and it will not be a spike? Because certainly there will be a spike, because price, market price is a matter of perceptions and anticipation and so on. But so there will be a spike in the price, and then if nothing will really happen, the prices will go down. But what will happen if they will not go down? Because these clashes will drag on. Those are the kinds of things that I am concerned of. And to sum it up, decision making is also a psychological issue. And when I am looking at the psychology of our current government, my conclusion is that usually they are very good in talking, in issuing threats, but when it comes to acting, they usually take the default decision option of not doing anything. So if you will ask me for my feeling, my intuition, I think we still have some time. Thank you.
Thank you all three very much for your presentations. I'm particularly comforted, General Brom, by the notion that Israel will not use nuclear weapons against the Iranian facilities. I seem to recall that there was an agreement that I think Avner Cohen wrote about between Golda Meir and Nixon, saying that Israel would not be the one to introduce, quote unquote, nuclear weapons into a conflict in the region. So that certainly comforts me. To get the conversation started, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how Israel, I guess you all say Israel is not bluffing, but it's certainly true that we have heard so many threats from so many Israeli officials over the last few months that I think there is this danger of crying wolf. So I'd like you all to address the notion that what happens if Israel does do nothing after such a spate of threats? What does that do in terms of a perception of Israeli deterrence in the region? What does that do politically to Bibi Netanyahu? He is thinking about running for re-election this year. Does he do better with or without starting a military conflict? Is that part of his calculation? And in terms of our own politics, I'm a little bit concerned that although I think President Obama has managed to counter Netanyahu in the short term, has he boxed the United States in by saying that the window for diplomacy is closing and that the U.S. red line is thus and such? So maybe we'll start in reverse order with General Brom and then work our way down.
I believe that too much weight is given to the implications of such a decision or a non-decision by the Israeli government. First of all, the Israeli public is used to promises that are not fulfilled. There will be nothing new in that. And I don't think that is especially typical for Israel when it concerns relationship between governments and the public. That is one point. Other point concerns the argument that Professor Telhami made about deterrence. I think you made too much of that. It is certainly true that deterrence is a very strong notion in the Israeli doctrine, in the Israeli strategy, but it is not true that we feel that our deterrence is eroded. No, what is important is what are the feelings of the security community in Israel. And the security community in Israel understands exactly the point that you have made, that we are actually in a very good situation because of we are succeeding in deterring Hezbollah, we are succeeding in deterring Hamas. Actually, no Arab state is really posing threats against Israel. And we understand also the effect of the Arab Spring, what is this German term, the zeitgeist of the Arab Spring, which is nonviolence. We are, of course, concerned of the longer terms of the Arab Spring, what it will do to the relationship between Israel and the Arabs. Will it erode the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan? But that pushes to the opposite direction, not to be more aggressive.
You know, if you look at the consequences of non-action within Israel itself, I think especially given the talk of the Israelis are going to have to walk away from that existential threat argument if, in fact, there is not going to be military action. Doesn't matter even what happens to Iran's program, because you box yourself in unless you're anticipating some future attack, because I think the morale issue is important. I think in some ways this whole hype of military attack did raise expectations in the region about Israeli power and Iranian power. I think it would weaken Israel's hand politically, but I think an attack would weaken Israeli deterrence more. That's the point that I was trying to make. Because when you look at the possible consequences, even if we don't know what the actual results are, and we don't, militarily, there are a lot of unknowns, and maybe Iran's military capabilities are more limited than we think. How many rockets can they shoot at Israel? My worry in that particular case is that you do have an escalation process. Israel doesn't like wars of attrition and doesn't like extended wars. I mean, never did, for a variety of reasons. And whenever there is a war of attrition, there's an escalation to make it shorter. And if the Iranians are just shooting 2 missiles at Israel a day, even if they're conventional with limited payload, they create so much uncertainty that paralyzes the economy and the international connectivity of Israel, and would create a sense of a weakened Israel and vulnerable Israel. And I think it would force Israel in some way to escalate, how to escalate without, whether you call it a war or not a war, I don't know, but I just can't see how you can limit it, even if the Iranians do not retaliate against American targets, which are more vulnerable to Iran than Israeli targets. So I see the consequences of attack as undermining Israeli deterrence far more than actually the absence of an attack, even there's some risk for Israel.
Yeah, Shibley, I think your point about wars of attrition goes for the U.S. at this point as well, that the country is not ready for another long, nasty war with rockets hitting barracks in Afghanistan or wherever else it is. And when you combine that with, and this is where I disagree a little bit with one thing that General Brom said, that because the Iran debate here goes on in multiple contexts, and there is a context that there is a group of Americans who, if they thought it would work, would be quite happy to have ground troops in Iran, unfortunately. So I think you would also, if the U.S. were pulled in, see a real temptation to escalate, a real pressure to escalate here, which over time it would be more and more difficult to hold back. Barbara, what you characterize as bluffing, I think I would actually just describe as 2 democracies debating their national security strategies in public. And so, as you both said, some of these folks are not bluffing, and they are not intending to bluff. But we're having this debate very publicly in a way that's quite unprecedented in either society. And so you can't blame the rest of the world for really being a little confused about what it is that's actually going on. And I think the last point about the president boxing himself in, I'm a little more sanguine about that than many people are, provided that a U.S. administration can figure out an outcome that's attainable and then explain it to anyone. So you could, for example, none of us has mentioned there are actually negotiations starting up next month between Iran on the one hand and U.S. and European partners on the other. And so there is always at least the hypothetical possibility that you could produce, there's not going to be a magic agreement out of the hat the first day that resolves all the U.S. and Israeli concerns, but there is certainly the possibility that you could create a process which would be moving forward, which would be sort of the antithesis of what we've seen in recent months. But that would require, on the U.S. domestic end and also on the Iranian and Israeli ends, which democracy is really complicated, the willingness to explain to the public and to spend political capital on why whatever it is we thought we could get out of the Iranians in negotiations is good enough. And that's where I do think there's a worry about how, at any time, how much capital a president has and how much he or she is willing and able to spend, assuming a limping economy and, whatever else might happen in the world.
Let me pick up on that point, because I think that's a very important one, and ask you all how you think Israelis, Americans, others would react to what one hopes would be an effort to manage this crisis. As Heather pointed out, there are talks coming up between the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and Iran, hopefully sometime in April. And if it were possible to get the Iranians to stop enriching uranium beyond 5% U-235, if the Iranians were to slow down the enrichment that takes place in the site near Qum, which is buried into the side of a mountain, would that be sufficient to make this debate go away for a while? If a process could be started that begins with some confidence-building measures that could be verified by the IAEA. And Shibley, you want to go?
That's all, Shibley.
I want to do first in part because I also did a public opinion poll here in the U.S. that I released 2 weeks ago. And so we have a little bit of a sense of where the American public is on this. Actually, the American public is very close to the Israeli public on this, whereas the overwhelming majority of the American public wants a diplomatic solution. Only 24% want to see an Israeli strike on Iran, very comparable to the Israeli percentages, particularly the Jewish Israeli percentages. And most think the war would actually last months or years, so they're worried about the attrition element. They don't think it's going to be a short thing. And most don't think they think it'll only delay the Iran project. So bottom line is, the public, I think, is primed for some diplomatic solution. The problem for the president isn't really finding a solution. I think you might be able to find an acceptable solution from the point of view of the American public and the president, but there are 2 issues that makes it complicated. One is our elections. As noted, Republican candidates, no matter what kind of solution you come up with, they're going to say he's throwing Israel under the bus. He's helping. And Santorum said that. By the way, just for your information, if you recall Rick Santorum in the presidential debate saying that Obama was throwing Israel under the bus and that he's helping Iran acquire nuclear weapons. This was headline news in Israeli press, in the major, including Yedot Ahronot, the most popular newspaper. And I did the poll in Israel the day after, and I asked them who they want to win the American presidential elections. Obama did better than, among Israeli Jews, he did better than every single Republican candidate, but especially did better than Rick Santorum, and Ron Paul did better than Rick Santorum in Israeli public opinion. So if you think this is sort of this kind of our debates are really resonating in Israel, they're not resonating in Israel on this question, but they are resonating in our politics. Whether these people are catering to the converted, the constituents of the U.S., whether it's influencing the independent views, which is obviously the constituency that the president has to be worried about, I don't know. I also would say that the other problem for him is not just that we're in a presidential campaign where he's going to be vulnerable. It's a question of how Israel will accept it or not. The Israeli posture for now is that they don't want to see any enrichment on Iranian soil. That is the posture. And so even if you go to whatever, 90-10 or 95-5 or whatever formula is possible, the Israelis are going to have to walk away from it, and whether they will or not will become an issue in our campaign as well.
Maybe the general wants to say on enrichment.
The question about whether Israel is bluffing or it really intends, I want to put a third possibility. And of course, all of them can be true at the same time. And the third possibility that actually it's a kind of cry for help. Because My interpretation of what the Israeli government is doing is that to some extent it is telling its allies, and mostly the United States, please rescue us from the need to take this decision, because it's not an easy decision. And because of that, of course, you are right in your description of the current Israeli position, no enrichment at all, etc. But I believe that if there will be the beginning, only the beginning of a movement towards solutions that may be reasonable, that will create a political situation that will make an Israeli decision to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities impossible politically. And one more point about the Israeli public. In many cases, the public is more intelligent than its leaders. And I think that with all these talks about the Holocaust and the existential threats and so on, the public is more intelligent than that, and that is reflected by your public opinion polls. So also the reaction of the public to the creation of a situation which we will make taking this decision redundant will be a sigh of relief to a much extent, here and in Israel.
Do we have time for one or two questions from the floor?
I'm going to say one thing while people are walking to the mic,
Please go for it.
which is, no, I want to say something nice about the American public, actually, very much in the vein of what General Brom has just said. The polling numbers have stayed constant over the last year. All of this yelling in the presidential primaries have not moved Americans. And Democrats and independents line up on one side, Republicans line up on the other. So the really interesting thing is, like I said, this isn't about facts and it isn't about Iran.
We've gone way too long. My apologies with our discussion up here. Let's take the first four people and just ask your question, and then everybody will have a chance to respond. I'm really sorry, but others obviously are going to want to get in this room for the next session. So, please.
Hi, I'm Judy Gelman from Amenu. As a preface to this, I just want to say that I unfortunately sat through all of the entire APAC convention, and so I'm well aware of what is being said, and I did it for organizational reasons. But here's my question, which was never addressed there, and which you haven't talked about, which is, if military action sets Iran back 1 to 5 years, are we facing an endless repeat of this discussion and process, even if there's, a wonderful surgical strike and there's no consequences? Is this something we're going to do forever after?
Okay, next.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering what we can learn from past Israeli strikes against nuclear facilities in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria.
Okay, quickly.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. Shibley Telhami may have mentioned this. I came in late. But all this saber rattling, has it made Netanyahu more popular in Israel, less popular in Israel? What's it done for his election chances down the road?
Okay, quickly.
I'm Sarah Pattison from Davis, California. Dr. Telhami said that Israeli Jews accept the concept of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. I'd like to ask General Brom, what's the view of that in the Israeli security establishment? And Ms. Hurlburt, you said war is a bad idea. Well, and what are we going to offer Iran? Well, what about regional arms control?
Okay, and this young gentleman, quickly, you want to just throw it in there, and then we'll open it up.
Hi there. I'm the web editor for New Voices magazine, National Jewish Student magazine. My question is, one of you said in the beginning that the U.S. public doesn't have the stomach for another war, that we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan for 10 years. But I think the fact that we've been there for 10 years is evidence that the U.S. public doesn't really care. There's no draft. What is there to suggest that this confrontation would be any different, that people would really take decisive action about this one, if not the others?
Okay. Why don't we just go right down and answer the questions you feel like answering.
Okay, so last question first. We're out of Iraq. There was an entire presidential election that was basically fought over getting out of Iraq, plus the 2006 congressional elections. We're also in the process of getting out of Afghanistan. You can like or not like how fast that is, but that's what's happening. You look at public opinion polls, people are done. People no longer think Afghanistan was worth it. So there is reason to believe, although I totally agree with what others said, that there would initially be a rally around the flag effect. Regional arms control, the challenge that you face is getting from the raw poll numbers and the general idea that this would be a good idea to any kind of regime. Right now, the comparison that's often drawn is to when the NATO-Warsaw Pact negotiations began under the Helsinki process in the 70s, and it took years and years of prep even to get to the point where you could sit down and do that, and it was vociferously unpopular here in the US. Particularly, people may remember there was a connection to Soviet Jewry that was often made around it. So unfortunately, we're years away. We have governments changing in the Arab world. We're years away, in best case scenario, from being able to get to regional regimes. And then last, so no, we won't go through the exact same thing over and over again. It'll get worse, because if the Iranians haven't decided to weaponize yet, we can sure assume that a strike is going to push that calculation in one direction. We're going to be uncertain about what we have hit, what we haven't hit, what the Israelis have hit, what they haven't hit. The IAEA won't be going there anymore, so it will be more fraught with less information as we go forward. So we could actually come to miss this phase of the discussion, I would conclude with.
Let me start with the easy question, which is the impact on Netanyahu. There's no evidence that it's had any impact at all. I think Israeli electoral politics have their own peculiarities and constituencies, and so it's hard to know how this will play itself out. On the nuclear-free zone, though, the Israeli position the official Israeli position has not been opposed to a nuclear-free zone. The Israeli posture has been, it wouldn't happen until there is full peace in the region. That has been the Israeli position. I think it would never happen before there's full peace with Israel. I think that is a reasonable posture. What I've advocated, particularly those of you who may have read my piece in the New York Times with Steve Cull last month on this issue, is that even if implementing any nuclear-free zone idea isn't going to happen anytime soon, you need to start a process that is regional, that starts the conversation, that puts downward pressure on proliferation, that creates a security arrangement that's regional. It changes the tone of the conversation. And I think the administration should exploit, and has supported in the past, although it's become much more of a reluctant supporter of the UN forthcoming resolution in Finland on this issue. Final point on just the repeat attack on Iran. Yes, I think it's a worry, but I think it's a worry bigger than just on the Iran. I think that is sort of built into Israel's principle of must have total technical superiority militarily over its opponents. And I think that locks Israel into a war every once in a while. And I think that's something that's going to have to be thought about in the coming years.
Will an Israeli attack has to be repeated? I can answer it by quoting an old Jewish joke. I don't know if you're familiar with this joke in the United States, and I usually forget jokes, so I don't remember how it starts. Anyway, in a certain stage in the joke, the Jew has to put the goat in his living room because of the landlord. And the joke ends with the sentence, the Jew comforts himself by saying, well, maybe the goat will die, maybe the landlord will die. So I think that is one of the problematic ideas around an attack of the nuclear program. There is a kind of belief that if we will achieve a delay, let's say the best case scenario, we achieve a delay of 5 years, then something will happen within these 5 years. And by the way, this belief has roots in precedences. Look at the Iraqi case. The Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear program didn't stop the Iraqi nuclear program, it only delayed it. But in the meantime, it gave Saddam Hussein the opportunity to make a stupid mistake and invade Kuwait, and that was the end of his nuclear program, actually, the real end of it. And look at the Syrian example. Once again, the Syrians could decide to continue with their nuclear program. But then chaos started in Syria, and probably there will be no nuclear program in Syria. So the belief is that something will happen in Iran, either any domestic change or something else. As to, I will only say a word about WMD free zone. Actually, there is an Israeli government decision from 1995, if I recall correctly, that Israel supports the establishment of a nuclear weapon of a WMD free zone after comprehensive peace is achieved. And there is much sense in it because there is no other example that such a zone was established between states that don't talk with each other, that don't have diplomatic relations with each other, etc.
Okay, thank all the panelists, and thank you. We go move on to the next sessions. Thank you. No, I know, and people would have wanted to. Oh, I was alert.
Sorry, because we would have had more from the audience, but